Law University School of Law has had a wonderful banner year as we've invited speakers and professors and lecturers from all across the nation to come here and speak at Duke Law. Our officers for the Federalist Society here are Brian Brook, who served as our president, and Amy Young. She's around here somewhere. There's Amy. She is our vice president of internal operations. And Dave Jetter, who I don't think is here right now. He's our VP of external operations, and I serve as VP of operations. Segregation is still an issue in the United States, and as we look around today, we know that covert and overt racism still exist in some ways. Much discussion is needed. We've invited Dr. Abigail Thernstrom to come speak with us today, and I have the honor and privilege of introducing her today. Now, an introduction for the woman of the hour. Dr. Abigail Thernstrom is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute in New York, a member of the Massachusetts State Board of Education, and vice chair of the state's Commission on Civil Rights. She received her PhD from the Department of Government, Harvard University in 1975. Thernstrom and her husband, Harvard historian Stephen Thernstrom, are the co-authors of America in Black and White, One Nation Indivisible, which the New York Times Book Review in its annual end-of-the-year issue named as one of the notable books of 1997. Their latest book, No Excuses, Closing the Racial Gap in Learning, was published by Simon & Schuster in October 2003. Thernstrom's 1987 work, Whose Votes Count? Affirmative Action and Minority Voting Rights, won 4 awards, including the American Bar Association's Certificate of Merit and the Anisfield Prize for the Best Book on Race and Ethnicity. It was named the Best Policy Studies Book of that year by the Policy Studies Organization and won the Benchmark Book Award from the Center for Judicial Studies. If you have not seen Dr. Thernstrom on the news or on national TV, you will see her soon. She's always on TV. I had the privilege of seeing her not too long ago. She's a very popular lady, and she's appeared on the Fox News Sunday, Good Morning America, and this week with George Stephanopoulos. For some years, she was a stringer for The Economist and continues to write frequently for a variety of journals and newspapers, including The New Republic, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Public Interest. President Clinton chose her as one of 3 authors to participate in his first town meeting on race in Akron, Ohio on December 3rd, 1997. And she was part of a small group that met with the president again in the Oval Office on December 19th. The title of today's speech is 50 Years After Brown. Why are we still talking about segregation? 50 years ago, the Brown versus Board of Education decision was rendered by the United States Supreme Court, and that decision's 50th anniversary was celebrated in 2004. In 2005, we reflect on the progress that we've made in the past 50 years in terms of racial progress in the United States and where we need to go from here. There is not a better person to speak on this issue than Dr. Abigail Thernstrom, and please help me in welcoming her to our event today.
Yeah, I need to do that. I need to also get a Kleenex here. I just realized. So hold on, everybody.
Bear with us for just a second.
All right. So let me just do what I'm supposed to do here, and also use a Kleenex a minute. James, thank you. Where are you? Thank you so much for that kind introduction. Small correction. It's actually the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and if anybody has got, and I make that correction only because I like to hear from people as to what the Civil Rights Commission is doing, and we're in the process of rethinking our agenda, what we should be, things we should be working on, and so forth. And it's nice not to work. It's nice not to work in a void. It's nice to hear from people. I have to tell you, a very funny thing happened on the way to this lecture today. I was having dinner last night with Brian Brook and Amy Young and Eric Smith, and towards the end of dinner I said, by the way, what is the topic you've announced that I'm talking about? Now, you have to understand this conversation about coming to Duke has gone on for some time. I don't know, it started last year at some point. And So they named this topic 50 years after Brown, and I thought, well, that's very interesting. I had not remembered that and remembered it at all. So that's not the talk you're going to hear. Too late to put that one together. And it's interesting because I actually gave that talk at the National Federalist Society Convention at the annual convention this year. And the easiest thing in the world would be for me to have dug that out and not have thought 5 minutes about what to talk about here. But instead, I did think 5 minutes or a little longer about it. And you're going to get a slightly different talk. But I'm going to offer a little kind of medley of thoughts on race, on education, and on the law. And my hope is obviously to provoke some sort of interesting discussion. I hope, but from a question I asked last night to those who so kindly took me out to dinner, this may not be so. I hope that many of you have at least read reports of the basic argument on affirmative action that Richard Sander made in the Stanford Law Review this past October. And Sander's bottom line, and I quote from his long article, his bottom line is, blacks are the victims of law school programs of affirmative action, not the beneficiaries. Race-based admissions significantly worsen blacks' individual chances of passing the bar by moving them up to schools at which they will frequently perform badly. Well, it was a familiar point. It was one in which, in fact, my husband and I made in a long UCLA Law Journal article a few years back. But Sander's statistical studies, and he had wonderful access to data, he adds a fascinating and important dimension to the already known basic picture. If racially preferential admissions were to end, he argues, the number of black attorneys would actually rise by more than 8%. That is, graduation and bar passage rates of aspiring black lawyers would so improve as to more than compensate for the drop in African American students admitted to the elite law schools. The end result, more black lawyers with better jobs, since many employers prefer strong candidates from weak schools rather than weak candidates from strong law schools. And hunting for a job, the black graduate with high grades, for instance, from the Suffolk Law School in Boston, might be much better off than the black graduate of Harvard Law School who falls in the bottom 10th of the class, which is about where about half of black law students fall. It's often said that preferential admissions opens doors, giving blacks and Hispanic students with relatively poor college records to show they can do just as well as whites and Asians. The problem is, of course, that inadequately prepared African American students do not, in fact, catch up in law school or in college, for that matter. For most students, it is much too late for such a catch-up process. In Grutter versus Bollinger, the University of Michigan Law School case that I'm sure all of you know, Justice OConnor, for the majority, did not even bother to make the catch-up argument. She focused instead on the educational benefits that diversity is a compelling state interest brought to the school, the promotion of cross-racial understanding, livelier, more interesting classrooms, and so forth. O'Connor's argument that diversity, defined as a critical mass of underrepresented minorities, that diversity was educationally essential, stopped short of preferences today, preferences tomorrow, preferences forever. 25 years earlier, as many of you may know, Justice Blackmun, in dissenting in Bakke, had said that racial double standards were not acceptable indefinitely. And he expressed the quote-unquote earnest hope that within a decade at most, affirmative action policies would be what he called a relic of the past. He was dreaming away. Affirmative action has become firmly entrenched in American higher education in the meantime, but the discomfort with permanent preferences remained on the court. And thus OConnor acknowledged that, quote, race-conscious admission policies must be limited in time. They are potentially dangerous, she said. They must be temporary. They must have a termination point. Equal protection demands unequal protection, but only for a while. In the last quarter of a century, she said, the number of minority applicants with high grades and test scores has indeed increased. There was every reason to expect that in another quarter of a century, the pool of academically high-performing Black and Hispanic applicants will have so grown as to make race-conscious admissions the strategy of a bygone era. The credulous reader might believe this confident optimism. This picture of preferences is nothing more than temporary medicine for a problem that is already fixing itself. The knowledgeable reader will know that OConnor was either scandalously ignorant of the real record or deliberately and irresponsibly deceptive. I don't know which is worse. Her expectation of just 25 years more was only one example of the careless, disingenuous pronouncements that litter the history of racial preferences in higher education and in other spheres as well. There was no empirical basis for her faith that the problem of a disproportionately low number of non-Asian minority students with strong academic skills will have disappeared by the year 2028, which is, in any case, an appallingly long time. I do not mean to suggest for a minute that the racial gap cannot be closed, but only that complacent optimism is deeply and indeed criminally misleading. Strong words about Justice OConnor. The best data on what American students know at the end of high school when they are ready to apply to Duke and other selective colleges comes from tests administered to a random sample of American students by the congressionally mandated, federally administered National Assessment for Educational Progress, NAEP. It's often called the nation's report card on education. And the NAEP results consistently show a frightening gap between the basic academic skills of the average African American and Latino student and those of the typical white and Asian. I'm going to give you a bit of data, but first, it's important to note that in my view, this is not an IQ story. It's a story of kids who have been tragically and needlessly left behind, who need to acquire skills and knowledge to do well in American society. Here's a very abbreviated glimpse of the racial gap based on the most recent 12th grade NAEP tests, which were administered in 98 and 2000. Age 17, typical Black or Hispanic student is scoring less well than at least 80% of his or her white classmates. On average, these non-Asian minority students are 4 years behind those who are white and Asian. They are finishing high school with a junior high school education. The typical employer who hires a Black high school graduate or the college that admits the average Black student is in effect choosing a youngster that has only made it through 8th grade. In 5 out of the 7 subjects tested by NAEP, a majority of Black students score in the lowest category, which is below basic. That means a majority of Black students do not even have a partial mastery of the fundamental knowledge and skills expected of students in the 12th grade. Hispanics are doing only a tad better. News no happier when we switch our gaze from the bottom to students at the top. If you take math, in math only 0.2% of Black students fall into NAEP's advanced category. Figure is 11 times higher for whites. It is 37 times higher for Asians. Again, Hispanics doing only a tad better. So with so few Black and Hispanic students with superb academic skills at the end of high school, the pool of those who are ready to do the work demanded of highly selective colleges, likely to become part of the American professional and business elite, it's inevitably very small. Picture was once worse, but the modest progress that occurred through the 1970s, much of the 1980s, came to an end around 1988 for reasons that we do not know. There's a bit of recent evidence suggesting improvements in learning for 4th and 8th graders, just a bit of improvement. NAEP has not tested yet, not again tested to date, 12th graders. But this smidgen of good news does not change the basic picture. What explains the gap? Conventional explanations include racial isolation, inadequate funding, class size, uncredentialed teachers. None of them stand up to close scrutiny. I can't go through here the weaknesses. Well, we lay them out in our most recent book, No Excuses, but I can't go through the weaknesses of each of these explanations. But just a brief comment on one of the suspects, that is racial isolation. And here I'm going to say something that we don't entirely say in No Excuses. American schools today are not segregated. They are not segregated. The charge of segregation or resegregation rests heavily on the work of Harvard education professor Gary Orfield, who labels all schools with a minority of whites, less than 50% whites, as segregated. But Orfield rejects the standard measure and much more sensible measure of segregation, which takes into account the racial composition of the community. By the standard measure, schools that are minority white, in Los Angeles, for example, which is a city that is over 70% Latino in its school children, and has a sizable Black and Latino population as well. Schools in such a city are not segregated. The racial composition of the schools simply reflect the demographic landscape in a city that is overwhelmingly non-white. Los Angeles is not unique. White enrollment in 26 out of the 27 of the nation's largest school districts, urban school districts, down to an average of 17%. It's a figure very few people know, and the only exception is Salt Lake City. The consequence? Of course schools are going to be majority-minority. Does that mean that learning is compromised? There is almost no evidence that kids learn more in racially mixed settings, and certainly none that they cannot learn without whites as classmates or whites and Asians as classmates. The problem with American urban schools is not that there are too few whites or Asians. Urban schools generally reflect not only the demography of the entire city, but also that of the neighborhood in which they're located. And racial and ethnic clustering in different sectors of a city, Koreans in one place, Jews in another, and so forth, that sort of clustering is American as apple pie. Why do we assume that in a racially and ethnically fair society, Black school children, unlike those who are, say, Jewish, will be randomly scattered across the residential and educational landscape? And that if they are so scattered, the racial gap in achievement will be greatly narrowed? Why do we assume that the random distribution of group members in housing and education is the ideal, the expected norm? That random distribution, at least with respect to non-Asian minorities, would not increase, from all the evidence, I'm sorry, let me put that point slightly differently. Absent that random distribution, at least with respect to non-Asian minorities, there is no reason to assume learning is compromised. If racially identifiable schools, teacher credentials, insufficient funding, and large classes don't explain the gap, what about the seemingly obvious explanation? Social class. Of course, needless to say, parental education, income, place of residence, they all make a difference in school achievement, but they account for only about a third of the gap the best social scientists have found. Group cultural differences seem to explain the remaining two-thirds, at least in part. Culture, it's important to stress, we use the word very reluctantly, but it's important to stress it does not imply a fixed set of group traits. It's a loose and slippery term. It's easily misunderstood. In No Excuses, we use the term to suggest values, attitudes, life skills that are shaped and reshaped by the environment, and part of that environment are schools. Culture matters, but it's fluid and it's open to change. Meeting the demands of school is certainly harder for members of some racial and ethnic groups than for others. Some group cultures are more academically advantageous than others. It's a point everyone knows that few are willing to discuss. Asian parents typically expect their children to work extraordinarily hard in school, and the children do so, cutting classes less often than their peers, enrolling in AP courses at triple the white rate, spending twice as much time on homework as their non-Asian classmates. As one scholar has noted, they are the Benjamin Franklins of our time, the group that has most intensely embraced the traditional work ethic. As a result, on some math tests, the white-Asian gap is actually larger than the black-white gap. But hard work is obviously a trait, a habit that members of any group, including whites, can acquire, and schools can play an invaluable part in shaping the habits and the skills and the values that make for long-run success. Process of connecting the typical black child to the world of academic achievement is not easy, and it's particularly hard when the students are from inner-city neighborhoods, but good schools know it can be done. The best inner-city schools all look very similar. They have greatly extended instructional time, more hours in the day, longer weeks, longer years. They have terrific principals who have the authority and the autonomy to manage their budgets, set salaries, staff the school with fabulous teachers, get rid of those who don't work out. These schools focus relentlessly on the core academic subjects, insisting that their students learn times table, basic historical facts, spelling and punctuation, the rules of grammar, the meaning of often unfamiliar words. They provide safe and orderly environments in which to teach and learn. But they also aim to transform this culture of their students as that culture affects academic achievement. These schools combat what Harvard sociologist Orlando Patterson, black himself, has called the greatest problem now facing African Americans, namely their isolation from the tacit norms of the dominant culture. What does combating isolation from the tacit norms of the dominant culture mean concretely? It means students show up on time every morning, including in some schools Saturdays and part of the summer. They must come with their homework done, ready to work, ready not to waste a minute of the day. They must walk into classrooms quietly, quickly, get to work. They must never lose their notebooks and must keep them well organized. They're expected to be properly, neatly dressed. When teachers or classmates talk, they must look at them, listen politely, silently. Students are always polite. When teachers give directions, these directions must be followed precisely. When sitting at their desk, they sit up straight. When they get up from their desks, they push their chairs in. Their desks are always neat, so are their notebooks. When a student speaks, his or her voice should be loud and clear so everyone can hear and understand. When visitors come, they're expected to shake hands, find a chair for them. When they talk to visitors or anyone else, they should look them in the eyes. When they leave the classroom and walk down the hall to another class, should be quickly, quietly, order in the halls as in the classroom. This is not a picture of your normal big city school, I promise you. And these are not add-on messages delivered on occasion by a principal or teacher. They are part of an entire school culture, and the expectations above permeate every minute of the day. Are we conservative here? Gregory Hodge, the head of the Frederick Douglass Academy in New York's Harlem, once asked me rhetorically. Of course we are, he answered. We teach middle-class values like responsibility. David Levin, one of the founders of the KIPP Academies, which are a wonderful chain of schools, has echoed Hodge. We are fighting a battle involving skills and values. We are not afraid to set social norms, he has said. As important as basic math are what journalist David Shipler has called the soft skills of punctuality, diligence, and a can-do attitude. Those skills enable kids to climb the ladder of American opportunity. Figuring out what great schools look like is not difficult. How to get there on a massive scale, that's the question to which no one has a reassuring answer, given the structure of public education with its built-in obstacles to the sort of fundamental reform that will be needed. What's wrong with American education is not the kids, it's the system. Of course, some kids come to school much more academically disadvantaged than others. That simply means schools must work harder and smarter to meet their needs. O'Connor's complacent reassurance in Grutter, her asserted belief that the racial gap in academic achievement will close in 25 years, finally obviating the need for preferential admissions, was appallingly irresponsible. Ignoring widely available facts, she painted a rosy picture when the truth is close to catastrophic. Her majority opinion in Grutter is a cover-up. The racial gap in skills and knowledge, not white racism, but the racial gap in skills and knowledge, is today the main source of ongoing racial inequality. That was not true yesterday. It is today. Those who care about the persistence of that inequality will not engage in such duplicity. They will say loud and clear, America must get its educational act together. A racially identifiable group of educational have-nots is morally unacceptable, and that is a problem that can be solved, but only if schools are radically transformed. Lawyers and courts can play a role in that transformation by not telling complacent lies and by having their junk detectors on if and when they become involved in one of the equal educational opportunity suits that are now blanketing the nation. They can play a positive role by rejecting junk social science that litters these cases and the conclusions drawn on the basis of misleading data. Don't believe, for instance, that big city school systems are starved for funds. They're not. They just waste money. Or that smaller classes are a good way to use their educational dollars. Do ask why middle-class parents, not those that are poor, have educational choices, and why private sector employers can choose their workforce, but principals can almost never choose their own staff. I could go on. I'll stop here. I don't want time to run out before you have time for questions. Thanks so much. And I apologize for not giving the lecture I promised. I will entertain questions, and I am switching glasses so I can see you. Yes.
I'm curious about when you referred to how somebody in the top of Suffolk Law School might be more attractive to a potential employer than someone at the bottom of, say, Harvard Law School. At least my own firsthand knowledge is that the top law employers don't go to Suffolk Law School. The partners don't go there to interview. They don't have relationships with the professors there. which kind of reflects generally on the notion that, maybe career achievement isn't totally tied to your overall educational merit, but to who you know. So I'm wondering if you have any statistics backing up that fact.
Right.
Or
Look, I think that's a perfectly good point, and it may be I may have picked an unfortunate example in Suffolk itself, but the statistics are in the Richard Sander article in the Stanford Law Review. The point surprised me as well, because my instinct would be to say, wherever you are in the Harvard class, you're better off than, even BC. Sander argues differently, and I was just simply outlining his argument. But again, I think you raise a perfectly valid question.
Are you assuming that the students in the bottom 10% of Harvard would be in the top 10% at BC?
Oh, I think there's a tremendous amount of evidence that, at least with respect to colleges, there has Sander, in working on the law school picture, worked in an area that very few of us have looked at closely, but at least there's a lot of data with respect to colleges and the cascade effect of that comes with the end of preferences. For instance, in California, after Prop 209 was passed, and what happened after the passage of Prop 209 was that, yes, the African American and Latino enrollment at the flagship schools of Berkeley and UCLA went down. The enrollment at the schools, down the food chain, as it were, in both the university and the California state system, that enrollment of African Americans and Latinos rose to compensate. And the result seems very, very clear that when you match student skills with the expectations and the skills of the other students in the schools, that the Black and Latino students are doing much, much better. So yes, they become, they come in with the skills and knowledge that everybody else is coming in with, and they have an equal chance to be at the top of the class instead of the bottom. Look, there's another point to be made about this. It's a point I put somewhat combatively in a Wall Street Journal op-ed I once did on the Bach and Bowen shape of the river. And then in our UCLA Law Journal piece, by the way, is a very extended review of that book. But the way I put it was, why do people think it's Yale or jail? That is, why do you have to go to Yale? What's the matter with the University of Connecticut? Why do you think that's make or break in American society? There is all the evidence in the world that America's elite in business, in politics, in the profession, haven't necessarily gone to the elite schools. You look at Harvard professors. My husband happens to be one. My husband has a BS in public speaking from a school of speech. Not a fancy degree. He's got lots of company of no fancy degrees, ending up with prestigious jobs. If you look at CEOs of companies, whatever, there is, I think, a greatly misplaced emphasis on the prestige schools in terms of life chances. Yes, somebody in the back, two people in the back.
I was going to say that I think that the division between Division I schools and Division II schools for law schools is something like $50,000 a year in the first year starting salary. So I'm not sure that, even though emphasis might be misplaced, the fact is that people coming from a school like this are going to make a lot more, at least for the first few years. In
the first few years. And the question is the long-run earnings, and I don't think anybody tracks those properly.
Yeah, I just had a question about you seem to be talking about two groups of blacks, and it seems that it's apples and oranges, where you talk about the high school kids at being tested at 12th grade versus blacks that are going to elite law schools, it just seems to me that those groups really don't have anything in common. I don't think too many of the black students here at Duke Law School or other elite law schools have problems at 12th grade level in the 12th grade. I don't think we tested at the 8th grade level.
Well, of course not. And when you're talking about group averages, you're talking about group averages. That's all. But group averages, of course, are meaningful. When we say, look, the average black family, that the wealth picture for the average black family is very different than that for the average white family, those averages are meaningful. We should care. When you're talking about high rates of black male unemployment compared to white male unemployment, and particularly in the younger years, you're talking again about averages, but averages matter. Now, of course, and I'm here looking at an elite law school, the NAEP average results are what they are. I mean, you're taking, again, a random sample of American students. But surely that's something we need to care about. And that's really my point. And I also think that the Rick Sander point has to be taken seriously when we talk about the case for preferential admissions. If it's right, it has policy implications. I think the article is worth looking at. There's a lot of debate over it. But in all the debate, his basic statistical data has not really been challenged. Yeah.
Can you speak to the issue of, part of that article spoke about the particular African American communities that were getting it, specifically not having come from, say, slavery, but being new Jamaicans or newer immigrants who might not have sort of this association back to the black community, the American black community as a whole. And isn't that part of the problem? Is that these are going to people who aren't necessarily giving back to, or the preferences are helping people who don't necessarily feel a connection to the American black community.
Well, I think that is a problem with preferences. That is, if you believe in preferences, the best case for preferences is preferences for African Americans and for those who, in fact, are Americans and whose families are the product of a long history of racial oppression in this country. There's no question about that. I thought you touched, though, on something something very closely related. That is the whole question of what the academic profile of children who are part of immigrant families, or at least whose parents were immigrants from Africa or the West Indies. A couple of years ago, it became public knowledge, and this was something I had actually known for a long time, but it became public knowledge that half of all Harvard's black students are from immigrant families. Now, that's a pretty shocking figure. But it does suggest something I think we see anecdotally again and again, which is that there's a real difference in terms of academic achievement between the black kids who are the product of American apartheid and black kids who are newcomers to America. Now, unfortunately, NAEP used to, but does not ask a very simple question, which the government could ask so easily, which is, what is the country of origin of your parents? And then we would get a breakdown of black newcomers and those who are the descendants of slaves and of the Jim Crow era and of segregated schools, in effect, even in the North. and segregated schools in the South until, the 70s. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the No Child Left Behind Act and how that's affecting the landscape of.
Well, NCLB is a very mixed bag. For those of you who don't know what it is, it's the latest revision of the 1965 Elementary and Secondary School Act. It was passed in December of 2001, signed into law in January 2002 by the president. And it is really a revision of Title I, which was the anti-poverty component of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And what it does is it spells out, there's always been a concentration in education on inputs, as it were. That is, money, class size, number of books in the library, whether teachers have a master's degree or whatever. And what NCLB says, forget about the inputs. We concentrate on the outputs. How much are kids learning? And our federal expectation, this is after all federal law, our federal expectation is that all kids will get up to proficiency by the year 2014. Now, proficiency was not spelled out. If it's the NAEP standard, that's absurd. I mean, it's like woebegone. But states define proficiency very differently. My view, if we can get every kid up to basic by the NAEP standard, by 2014, we will be doing really well. It demands periodic testing in grades through 3. Well, it demands testing every year in grades through 3 through 8, and then testing once in high school. The president is now talking about extending the testing to all the years in high school. And the virtue of that testing is twofold. One, it tells schools how much the kids know, and it insists, as part of the law, that the schools break down their scores by subgroups so that a wealthy, largely white and Asian suburb cannot hide the fact that its minority of Black and Hispanic kids are not doing well. Those Black and Hispanic kids also have to be up to proficiency by 2014. So there's no more kind of winks and nods about how good the schools are. They have to educate all kids. That is a very good aspect, just the sunlight, the exposure, the transparency of how much kids are learning in the schools. It has, it seems to me, and again, I'm on a state board of education, so and we've had high-stakes testing for some time. The NCLB doesn't have high-stakes testing. That is, it doesn't demand an exit exam in order to graduate from high school. But we've had high-stakes testing for some time, and what impresses me is that all the urban superintendents are for it, because it forces teachers to finally take seriously all their kids and to get together and to think about how to teach better and so forth. And so, I think NCLB is pressuring schools in the right direction. It's also got a choice component. I'm a big voucher advocate, but it politically could not embrace vouchers. It does have a choice component for public school choice only. I don't know where a kid in Boston, in Detroit, in Atlanta, in Chicago, in Los Angeles goes when the school is not teaching the kids, because there are no schools to go to that have any room. There are no good schools to go to in places. In most of these big urban school systems, the kids need to be let out of the public school system. NCLB does not do that. So limited choice, the right idea. Also, the capacity to use Title I dollars for private tutoring, and that seems to me a very good element. So I think it's a mixed bag. I also think because it sets a standard that cannot be met, it's likely to be radically changed over the years. It's likely to be collapsed. It's it's the usual congressional rhetorical junk, as in Goals 2000, where America's going to be the best in science and math by the year 2000. Oh, sure, tell me another. And, again, this is not a possible goal. And the danger of impossible goals is that states will start to really rebel because they cannot meet them, and because they got a lot of money, federal money, tied to meeting what the demands of NCLB. I think there was a hand back here, and then there, then there. Yeah.
When you were talking about grade school, you suggested that the schools needed to have the initiative and the capability to work smarter, to adjust to the skill sets of the different students. And it seems to me that you also suggested that the minority students in elite schools were not doing as well as they would be in other schools because they lacked a skill set. So I'm curious, what responsibility, if any, do you think those elite schools have to work smarter to adjust to the skill set?
Well, and these are all very good questions, obviously. I like the fact that in the University of California, students, and it only happened with the end of preferences, which the chancellor admitted, the end of preferences in California triggered it. I like the fact that the schools are putting tutors into inner city schools. I think that's great. I think that by the time students arrive in high school, in general, as I said, it's awfully late. I think you've got to catch kids by about 5th grade. There are too many kids in regular district public schools that don't really read by 5th grade. They don't read by 6th grade. If the kid doesn't read by 3rd grade, massive intervention should take place. I would like to see schools and the students in these elite schools get more involved in rescuing kids. What could be more worthwhile in life than rescuing kids? And it's very interesting. Yale, of all the elite schools, that is the only one among the elite schools, it has got a whole bunch of graduates that have started charter schools in the inner city or are working in inner city schools. They've gone to Teach for America, so they haven't gone through dumbed down education schools. They've gotten in through another route. And it's interesting, and I think it's because Yale is very involved in the public schools in that city. Yes?
So I think it's really hard to argue with your normative conclusion that elementary, in particular elementary education, needs to be improved. You can quibble with the methods. I don't want to do that. My problem is that normatively linking the subject of improving early childhood education with ending racial preferences, that you always end up shifting the topic away from the cohort of students, primarily African-American students, between now and 2014, if we achieve those goals, who, according to your own description, have been educated so poorly they've been set up to fail. And we never offer any kind of policy prescriptions for how the African American community is supposed to address cultural issues that you claim exist. If we simply leave this cohort who's been set up to fail without any method of addressing the problems that we've left them with.
Well, I didn't say set up to fail, did I? I said,
I don't mean to ascribe.
yeah, I said that there was a problem with mismatching kids and the expectations of the school and the average skills of the students in the school, and that there is considerable evidence that when you stop the mismatching, that the non-Asian minority students do better. And that and that there's a lot of evidence for that. I don't want students abandoned, but that just goes back to why are we so hung up on these elite colleges point? I'll just speak personally, I was not ready to go to a Harvard or a Yale or a Duke when I graduated from college. I just wasn't ready for a variety of reasons, home life, etc. I hadn't concentrated at all on learning anything in school. My life was too messed up. you know, so what? This is the most wonderfully open society in the world. If you go, England, even in your obituary, they put whether you got a first at Oxford or Cambridge and or not, and you know, and certainly whether you went there, and it's really life determining whether you go to one of to what's called Oxbridge, to unite those two schools, or one of the red brick universities or what have you. That's not America. This is America of first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth chances. And all I'm saying is, it's not the end of the world if you don't go to an elite school. And there is considerable statistical evidence that students are better off going to the schools that where their skills match those of the other students. I mean, nobody, and one more point on that. The college entrance rate for black kids is very high. The college graduation rate is very low. Why are black kids, dropping out of college? Surely, one of the reasons is if you go to a school in which you're struggling, you're likely to get more discouraged. And there's also a reason why 9 out of the 10 colleges that send black students on to PhDs are the historically black colleges. The 10th is Wayne State, which is overwhelmingly black also. Those aren't schools that discourage kids. So my point is not that this is a good picture. I want the numbers up at all the highly selective schools. My point is simply, in order to get those numbers up, you better start looking at the early grades. We're not going to get there otherwise. Yeah, was there somebody here first?
Related to the previous question, I'm wondering how optimistic you are about the solution that you suggested. I mean, is enough meaningful progress being made to transform the school system right now or in near future?
I'm not very optimistic. I'm not very optimistic because of the power of the teachers' unions, which are a recipe for the unions are a force for the status quo. They're an employment system. Kids come last. Most schools are a recipe for mediocrity. But they are entrenched interests. And it is partly why I'm such a voucher advocate. Let the kids out. And it's why, where you've got private voucher experiments, or the few public ones, Cleveland being one of them, why you've got black parents on these incredibly long waiting lists to get their kids into a parochial or private school. And by the way, the parochial schools are doing a much better job with inner city disadvantaged kids. And a lot of the charter schools that I loved modeled themselves on the parochial schools. And I do not speak as a Catholic, by the way. Just as a footnote. So, I'm not terribly optimistic unless we can get inner city parents to get angry. And their anger is way overdue. Way overdue. How dare you give me a computer printout that tells me that my child is going to the following lousy and unsafe school. It's a scandal. It's a moral scandal. And no middle-class parent stands for that. A good definition of a middle-class family. Forget about income. Is it $40,000? Is it $50,000? Is it $35,000? Forget about income. Middle-class families have school choice. They either choose their place of residence or they choose to pay tuition to a parochial or a private school. Only the poor are left with no choices. Is that fair? Does that speak of a commitment to equality? It's morally repugnant. Anyway, somebody had a question, another question in this direction.
I was saying, doesn't the Sanders data also suggest, though, that at the elite schools which you were referring to, that graduation rates overall are much higher, and that effect is substantially greater for minorities?
Yes.
I mean, doesn't that sort of undercut the idea that the choice then, is not necessarily between Suffolk and Harvard, but Harvard and nothing, perhaps? I mean, isn't...
No, wait a minute. He's suggesting the graduation rates go up with a closer match between student and school.
I was under the impression that graduation rates were higher overall for minorities and generally in the upper schools.
I don't remember him making that argument. I think his argument was the graduation rates go up and bar passage rates go up substantially, both. I could be wrong. I could not remember the article properly. I didn't look at it in the last week when I was thinking about this talk, but no, I may have that data right here, but I'm not sure. And anyway, I'm not going to be able to read it without my reading glasses on, but that is what I remember, that you've got both graduation rates and bar passage rates going way up. Somebody else had a question. Yes. You.
Okay. I guess this isn't really addressing your main point, but kind of one of the side points you mentioned about the racial composition of schools reflecting their communities.
Right. I was wondering why nobody picked up on that. That was the most outrageous thing I said in the whole talk.
I guess what makes me, I guess, a little skeptical about that is, say you talk about Los Angeles or any of the major cities that are so vastly minority now, they were not so up until about the 1970s when the courts finally started putting Brown v. Board into effect and like making it effective. After that, there seemed to be a good degree of white flight. Those who could afford to get out of the areas where there was integration got out into the suburbs, and where there were majority white schools, because that's where most of the white people went. They reflected that community where they could afford to get to. Whereas the poorer minorities could not, and it seems to me that just saying that the schools reflect the composition of their community, and that's something equivalent to the self-selection, as in like the various ethnic groups that combine and say in New York City or very ethnically diverse cities. That doesn't seem to be correct. It seems to be that those who could afford to get out, who wanted to get out, who didn't want integration, were able to do so, and those who could not afford to get out had to stay. And that goes to some of your point about choice, but I think you've got an inaccurate explanation. I think white flight has lots more to do with the composition of the communities. I don't think that's enough of an answer. More of a statement.
You've got a whole bunch of things in there. Let me see if I can pull them apart a little bit and answer them. I think you're wrong on your basic explanation, what we're looking at. Yes, you're perfectly right that in the 1970s, there began to be a movement out of the city on the part of the middle class, period. We now, as a consequence, I would not link that basically to the desegregation efforts. Blacks began to get out of the city as well. Now in suburbia, over a third of black families now live in suburbia. Suburbs are almost, blacks are about 13% of the American population. Suburbs on average are now close to that 13%. Would I like to see more black families in the suburbs? Sure. But the fact is that the movement out to the suburbs has been on the part of people who can afford to get out of the inner cities. Of course, you had in some cities, Detroit, for instance, never got over the riots of at the end of the 60s, and you had tremendous push out of the city as a consequence of that. You had changes in transportation, that is the highway program, and so forth. So there are multiple reasons why you have increased suburbanization, and blacks have been part of that increased suburbanization and continue to be part of that increased suburbanization. Now, I do not for a minute, you are perfectly right to say that the history of blacks in terms of residential clustering has been different than any other group, than that of any other group. That there was coerced segregation for blacks and wasn't the same coerced segregation for, let's say, Italians or the Poles in Chicago or whatever. However, the question is today, in 2005, to what degree are the demographic patterns still the consequence of that coercive history, or are African Americans becoming another American ethnic group? And to what degree, and is this part of the picture? We're writing our next book on that question, but I haven't got the answer yet. And I mean, I find that a very, just the word African American, the hyphenated word, suggests another American ethnic group. And when you look at places like Prince George's County, right outside of D.C., or a lot of the heavily black, wealthy suburbs around Atlanta, people are making choices. About 10 years ago, something like that, and this, by the way, has been, I'm going down a kind of road myself that I was not on for until recently. So some of what I said is new and is not in our book, no excuses. But about 10 years ago, I had an extended discussion with a black reporter from the Los Angeles Times who had written an autobiography. And I said, he said, "Did you like my book?" I said, "Well, there are things that really bothered me about it. Like every room you walk into, you count the number of blacks. You were determined to live. You have a middle-class income. You were determined to live in a heavily black community." I said, "That bothers me. I want a race-blind America." And he looked at me and said, in effect, "What's the matter with you?" And I've come to see his question is right. What's the matter with me? Why is it that I should have demanded that a black family drive 10 miles to see another black family when I don't demand that of any other group? And indeed, just to tell a personal story, we lived in Los Angeles my husband was teaching at UCLA. I was not working. I was being a full-time mom. And we came back to Harvard. My husband came back to Harvard, and I came back and finished up my dissertation and so forth after a long hiatus. But anyway, looking for a place to live. We knew we didn't want to go back to Cambridge. So I'm shown the town real estate in the town of Winchester, which is right next to the town I live in, which is Lexington. And I said to the real estate agent, "Winchester? There are no Jews in Winchester. I don't live in towns where there are no Jews." Now, one, I'm not married to a Jew. Two, my parents were relentlessly anti-religious, even though they were ethnically Jewish. Where does that come from in me? A sense of community. A sense of identity as a Jew. And why do Americans so often look at blacks and say, "You're not entitled to that same sense of community"? It really goes back to the Ralph Ellison question that he posed about Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, in which he said, how can you argue that black culture is nothing but pathology, that it's just the consequence of white racism, when we have a rich culture as a people who have survived? And so I'm playing around with these ideas and playing around, and it is a new road for me to be going down. So I'm going down it very gingerly, and I love getting input. And I particularly love getting input from people who are either African American or Hispanic, or who feel otherwise a strong group, a sense of group identity. When sociologists first began to look at the demography of cities, which was, it was a group at the University of Chicago in the 1920s, they looked at these clusterings of ethnic groups, and they saw that as perfectly normal and celebrated it. Of course, blacks at the time, their isolation again was coerced. Yes?
When you stress that the Yale or jail statement is ludicrous, it seems like it's sort of inconsistent with your emphasis on the concreteness of the lack of progress in elementary school, where you're saying in elementary school, whatever happens there, then it can't happen, you know, they're done, it's over. But then when you start talking about college, you're saying, you don't need to go to Yale, you can go to, you know, wherever, Suffolk, I don't know if that's a college.
No.
And you can catch up, you can do fine. If you go to Suffolk, it doesn't matter, you can still become the most successful American in the United States. And so at some point there is like a catching up in terms of skills, in terms of maturation. I'm sure plenty of us in this room have had that process. So how is it that you can say you can catch up later in life, but then also say what happens in elementary school is that's set in stone then what your life path is or whatever?
Well, I didn't quite say set in stone, but what I did say is, look, skills and knowledge are important. You can't even work in a Honda plant today without basic math skills. Skills and knowledge are important. In general, if you want to climb the American ladder of opportunity, you got to have those skills and knowledge. But I'm also saying, if you have the skills and knowledge to go to wherever, a highly selective school that is using racial and ethnic double standards in admissions, it is worth thinking about whether those double standards are doing students the favor that is generally assumed. And that is the Rick Sander argument, and that is an argument that, again, my husband and I made at great length, but not about the law schools. We were looking at college data in the UCLA Law Journal. So I don't think there's any contradiction. You got to have skills and knowledge. We cannot have a racial gap, the racial gap that we do. It is morally unacceptable. It is, I mean, you're talking about awfully basic skills. We have an exit exam in Massachusetts for high school graduates. It's basically an 8th grade exam. So I'm saying these skills and knowledge have to be acquired, that most of the racial inequality today in America can be traced to unequal skills and knowledge. Very good data on equal earnings, lifetime earnings of people who have equal skills and knowledge, not equal years spent in school. That's generally how education is measured. Oh, do you have a high school degree? Do you have 2 years of college? Do you have 4 kids? No, equal skills and knowledge, not years warming a seat in school. Makes a difference.
But if you go to UNC Wilmington instead of UNC Chapel Hill, assuming that you were not as strong of a candidate, and that's why you went to UNC Wilmington instead of Chapel Hill, say, but then I know you're not saying that, well, you go to UNC Wilmington and your ultimate destination in life is to make $30,000 and the Chapel Hill person can make $80,000. And then assuming that where you end up is somehow just, that there is like, you know, a telos, a direction that, you know, makes sense, that people are evaluated and have opportunities that are fair, it seems like you have to say then that during your time at UNC Wilmington, you either mature or you gain skills or whatever, like there is change, there is
for some students
catch up. But you're then saying that at Chapel Hill that can't happen.
No, I didn't say can't happen. I just said generally doesn't happen.
We'd certainly like to thank you for your time. And on behalf of Duke University School of Law and our Federalist Society, we thank you so much. If you guys could join her in the loge outside, we really appreciate it. Once again, thank you so much.